If we follow the geopolitical change, and needless to say that today, majority of the countries are standing at the crossroads, particularly in this political and also in this economic standpoint. Now, the question we should ask today, as we continue to pay attention to the presidential election in the US, and even though that we still don't know who will become the next president for the country, but meanwhile, we still need to understand how should we understand the role of China today. And there's no secret that China and US are still locked in this competition, particularly in this technological advancement and also this energy resources. But meanwhile, if we follow the news closely, when it comes to the continent of Africa, the two countries are actually competing in a much greater and also more intense way. Now, recently, that according to the news, current US President Joe Biden pledged or mentioned recently that he planned to name Kenya as a major non-NATO ally. What message did that send to the rest of the countries in Africa? And what does that say about the role of China? Should we be very worried and concerned when it comes to the energy and also the resources assumption at this moment? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, and who is the Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he focuses on international law, international relations, and in Brazil, and he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at the China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Marcus, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Always a great pleasure to talk to you, Will, and to your audience.
Well, Dr. Marcus, I want to get started. As I mentioned in the intro, that recently the sitting US President Joe Biden planned to name Kenya as a major non-NATO ally. How should we understand this cooperation or this collaboration between US and some of the countries in Africa? All of a sudden, that the whole world start to wake up and realize that the countries in Africa today are one of the hot topics, especially locking in this geopolitical competition. How should we understand that at this moment?
I think, Will, that we do see in Africa this phenomenon that we call great power competition, in which you have China, the United States, Russia, the European Union, all of them trying to get some space. Of course, you know, the African continent has some bad memories of the colonizers, right? You have to remember the devastating impact that European colonization had in Africa. You know, in one way, it may have organized the countries with different political systems, but on the other hand, has left a legacy that is very complicated for African countries. You know, to this day, African countries have distribution network problems, like for food, or, you know, the continent is not integrated through airlines. So you might have, if you want to go from one place in Africa to another one, you might have to go to the former capitals, colonial capitals, or you may have to go to Istanbul or Dakar or Qatar or somewhere to go back to another African continent. Africa does have two very important factors that we should not forget. It's still a country, it's still a continent, that has a demographic bonus, right? You know, the African continent is still growing population-wise. It will reach more than 2.5 billion, I think, in the coming years. The population is young. And this is an important thing for being like the last frontier of cheaper labor, and also a huge consumer market yet to be developed. So that's number one. Number two, that we should not forget, is the proximity that it has for countries that are the developed countries, like, you know, the consumer powers like the United States and the European countries. So Africa has that close territorial proximity that facilitates, for instance, for Chinese companies to start producing in Africa and start selling in the European continent or in the United States. using the benefits that sometimes African nations might have in those countries. Finally, and I said 2 points, but let me make a third one, which I think is very important too, is certainly the abundance of natural resources that Africa has. Of course, when you consider Russia as a country, Russia has lots of natural resources, but it makes sense, from a strategic viewpoint, for you to have access to multiple suppliers of natural resources. And, China is a country that, to keep its growth, does need natural resources from other places. And I think it makes sense for China to have, an increased relationship with African countries. Now, the challenge is that somehow you do see that the Americans have been trying to get Chinese development or Chinese growth to be somehow reduced, or they're trying to restrict growth, or trying to deter China, and in many places and in as many ways as it is possible for the U.S. to guarantee that its hegemony status is not lost. And you do see that also taking place in the African continent. So NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was created for the protection of the European countries against the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was over, NATO had no reason for being anymore. But still, the Americans have kept that organization, and it has been quite challenging because all of a sudden you see NATO having these agreements with, South American countries, now Africa, and trying to build, or even in Asia, coming to Korea, to Japan, and trying to build a network somehow, not against the Russians this time, but against China. So it's a complicated matter that, the Americans might use the defense card, and through the defense card try to, restrain Chinese growth. And that's one of the problems, and that's one of the many challenges I think that China will face wherever it goes now around the world.
Dr. Marcus, I want to talk about this Belt and Road Initiative. We know today that when we talk about China, the number one word that comes to everyone's mind is the word economy, or we're looking at this economic agenda or economic projection. Well, again, Dr. Marcus, you're the expert. There's no surprise that majority of the countries that on the continent of Africa actively participated under this Belt and Road Initiative. But meanwhile, we've seen some pushback from some of the countries in Europe, for example, Italy, that decided to pull out herself from this Belt and Road Initiative. So in other words, at this moment, and also at the same time, that some countries are still questioning this ambition or this what we call authenticity of the Belt and Road Initiative regarding trade and regarding this export, import, etc. So the question to you is how reliable it is today that when we look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, and is it still rather advantageous, particularly to the countries in Africa? And also, why do you think some of the European countries start to put a question mark regarding the Belt and Road or BRI's ambition? Your thoughts?
My viewpoint, Will, is that countries that cannot defend themselves do not really have full sovereignty. And that's the case of Italy, right? You have American bases in Italy, you have them in Germany. And of course, at the end of the day, they might feel challenged to comply somehow to what the United States might ask them to do, or even, suggest, right? And of course, we have seen a change in government also in Italy, right? And the problem is that the political shifts that we observe in many places in the world, one of the things that people tend to use is to transform the Chinese growth into a political matter and into this polarization that we have between left and right, and say, oh, China is a communist country and, they're leftists, and then any government that comes from the right will try to oppose the Chinese investments and all that. So we do see, and I've seen that in Brazil, my own country, in the previous administration, where there are so many issues associated with this political stupidity But that's part of the process of times, and those are the times that we live now, in which political polarization has really been a major challenge to overcome. But there is no doubt that out of all the countries in the world, the only country, developed country, or developing country, the only country that has money to invest is China, right? The IMF just reviewed the process and said that China is going to grow 5.5% this year. It's the only country that is growing at such a rate. And you have to remember that China is a huge economy. It's the second largest economy in the world when it comes to absolute terms, but, largest economy in the world in purchasing power parity. And you do see one very important thing, Will, that is, growth in the world is not led by the U.S. Growth is led by China. Because, being the number one partner of more than 140 countries and territories around the world, being the largest consumer in the world, being the largest buyer, number one trading partner for many countries around the world, there's no doubt that China is the driving force for economic growth and economic development. The U.S. still retains the role of being in the number one country when it comes to financial issues. But, time will go along and the dollar has this prevalence in the international community. So that place for the U.S. is secured for some time. But, when we talk about economic growth, and all these countries need economic growth, all these countries need to produce, all these countries need to sell products, and all these countries need technology and disruptive innovations. And all these is going to come not from the relationships that they have with the United States or the Europeans, because, they have been there, right? The new kid on the block is China. And certainly you do see that the nature of the projects that Belt and Road has done in Africa has been, much more advantageous to countries. Of course, here and there, you might hear people saying, yeah, but, there's that trap. You hear always the same excuses and the same accusations against China. But at the end of the day, China is the only country that is investing in in many of those countries, and investing in projects that they need and that they request. It's not China that imposes the projects. It's the countries that demand. And of course, China being a country that has a long history of infrastructure, major infrastructure projects, tunnels, roads, railroads, everything that you can think about. Certainly, China will always have an appetite in all those African countries for infrastructure projects. And that's the nature of China. So I think that Belt and Road is one of the best things that has been developed by China. And, here and there, some countries might feel the pull or influenced by the U.S. to somehow, question or leave. But we know that it is dependent on the political moment. One final example, Will, you will recall that recently BRICS had an expansion, right? And Argentina was included in the process. And then we got a new elected president who tends to think that he's more right-wing and all that, and he decided to give away or give up his membership on BRICS, which is something that Argentina will certainly regret in the future. But my viewpoint is this, this is part of the polarization process and time that we're living in. So that's the challenge that we see, and I shouldn't worry so much in that sense.
Dr. Marcus, let's keep our conversation going. According to Johns Hopkins University's China-Africa Research Initiative, that back in 2021, that China's annual foreign direct investment in Africa increased from 75 million in 2003 to a 20-year high of 5 billion in 2021. I mean, again, this is a huge jump when we look at this economic market and we look at this investment opportunities. But meanwhile, Dr. Marcus, everyone is very concerned. Let's bring another perspective, is the military presence from China. I mean, again, we're looking at the war in Ukraine, and also, of course, the numerous times that you mentioned about Russia. Everyone to say that China, the reason why it's actively, or you call it heavily, investing in Africa, part of the reason, or proportionally the reason, is from the military perspective. So, Dr. Marcus, again, you're the expert. how much can we buy into such rhetoric that in order to pour more money into the continent of Africa, China is actually thinking about enlarging its military base, or even actually from this military perspective to compete with the US? Is any of the statement false, or how much can we buy into such rhetoric at this moment?
I think you should not buy into the rhetoric, right? I think there's only one Chinese base in Africa, which is in Djibouti, right? Or the French call Djibouti. I think that's the only place that China has a presence. The Americans have so many bases around the world. I don't know whether it's almost 500, if not more. So, Chinese military presence in Africa is really nothing compared to what the presence of the United States is around the world when it comes to military bases. And you see, and the problem is that people don't realize is that somehow when the American bases come, the sovereignty goes away, right? That says that you're not fully independent. So I wouldn't be concerned about that. And second thing, Will, that I think is very essential to remember is that when I look into China, and I look into the last century, for instance, I do see that Chinese military engagements around the world, the Chinese military engagements have been very, very few. China has a long history. It's not a country that has this need to be fighting all the time. It's part, I think that the greatest motto about China is peace and tranquility, right? Peace and harmony. And I do think that sometimes it's hard for the West to understand a country that has a different philosophical perspective of life and the interaction with other countries and how China perceives itself. So I think that China as a civilization is extremely different from some of the theories and perspectives that we have in the West. And I think that the problem is when we analyze China from the Western perspective, we really lose the capacity to understand China as it is, according to the Chinese, according to Chinese philosophy, according to Chinese perspective. And I think that's why we somehow, we have this, Western civilization idea that we need to be constantly engaged in a war. When you visit Europe, one of the things that you always visit is castles, which are fortresses. Europe is a continent that has had hundreds of years of war. I think that there was a study saying that within, I think one of the historians at Oxford made a comparison that in 500-year comparison, Europe had engaged in more than 150 wars, while China had only engaged in 3 wars. So I think that is something that we in the West do not understand. But we do try to project that on China, trying to think that China needs to behave the same way. And one of the first things that we learn is that China does not want to play the role of being the world Sharif, right? China doesn't want to be, the world police implementing its, perspective and everything around the world. Because it's not the Chinese nature. It's not the Chinese perspective. Now, I think I forgot to mention, but I think one of the things that people should learn from China, more than being concerned about the Chinese eventually going to come with a military and invade countries and intervening countries, which is something that is, one of the first Chinese basic principles is non-intervention. But I think that one of the things that China can really do, and it's the most relevant soft power that China has, is certainly to teach the world, particularly the developing world, how you can change the whole country within one generation. And the enormous growth that one country can make if there is a resolution that the population wants to live in a better place. So I think that the most relevant Chinese soft power for me is the Chinese development model that maybe it should be adapted as the best practices case for countries to follow. And in Africa, you do see that because all the Western recipes and prescriptions that we have followed, and particularly the African continent and also in Latin America, many of these policies that have been implemented have not worked well. So I do not see China being, military. It's not the scope of China to have this enormous military presence like the Americans have. And I think that eventually what really matters to the people is not the military, but the economic welfare. And I think the Chinese approach is the correct one in that sense. Grow the economy, make people rich, and then we'll talk about other stuff. But the most important thing for Africa is to get wealthy first.
Dr. Marcus, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Let's bring Russia into our dialogue. Now, again, China has been mentioned from the left to the right when we look at the war in Ukraine. And of course, we continue to look at this disaster in Gaza, and of course, this war between the Hamas and Israel, etc. But meanwhile, that before the Chinese president embarked his recent journey to Serbia, to France, and to Hungary, that Vladimir Putin actually paid a short visit to China, and right after he's started with a new term of the presidency, of course, that caused this political wave within the international community and a strong reaction from the West. Dr. Marcus, at this moment, how should we assess this partnership between China and Russia at this moment? And of course, recently we also heard the statement from the Ukrainian President Zelensky continue to pressure more countries in Asia, or even particularly in Southeast Asia, regarding the support and also this unconditional support to Ukraine. So putting everything together, should China turn, or we say change its behavior or the strategy, or China should continue to do what is best for the world? Your final thoughts.
I think that China is the only adult in the room, right? Because it's the only country that has preserved the power to influence Russia to change its behavior, and no country in the West has it. I think that in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, the greatest fear that the British had was an association between Germany and Russia. German with the brains, Russia with the resources. Now, the Americans somehow repeated now the association between Russia and China, right? You know that in the past, that was one of the reasons why we had the proximity of the United States and Russia and China in the 70s. Now, I do think that it is important for China and Russia to work together, in the sense that even though people might disagree in many ways on the way the countries and the way they're organized politically and all that, but I do sense that there is a feeling around the world that the current global governance does not really correspond to the needs of the populations and the peoples around the world. We do feel that the global order that was established in the 1940s, really needs to change, and it needs to incorporate other values. Now, of course, nobody likes to see the war in Ukraine, but one needs to remember that the war in Ukraine is the result of this effort by NATO to expand into other parts of the world. And we know, whether you like it or not, when we have a big neighbor like Russia or the United States, the countries that are neighbors cannot be free, or they're not free entirely to choose whatever they want. If Mexico were to choose to belong to an alliance run by China or Russia, I'm sure that the Americans will really create major problems for Mexico through embargoes, through sanctions and all that. You can tell that by what happens in Cuba for the last, almost 7 decades of an embargo. So I think that the association between China and Russia is important, first of all, because it guarantees China access to natural resources that China misses and China lacks. And I think it's an important thing. And also, somehow the Chinese actions have really been able to allow Russia to navigate through the enormous sanctions that Russia has suffered for a long time. And somehow that trade has allowed the government of China to, increase the presence of Russian products here. But also, it has been very important for Russia because Russia, despite all the efforts around the world, was able to grow economically and really challenge many of the premises of the West when it comes to imposing its will or forcing its will. Now, Zelensky has one huge challenge. He hasn't won anything. All the counteroffensive promises that he made never really, consolidated and become something really effective and successful. So he is really concerned and pressed by time because he knows that the American election could have two results. If Biden is reelected, Zelensky will be happy and all that, but nobody knows how long Biden will really keep the support for Ukraine, because we know that Biden has to keep the support for Ukraine now because of the elections, right? But we do not know what will happen after this ends, because it's been cost the U.S. Taxpayers some money, and it's very hard to justify that. And on the other hand, if Donald Trump gets elected, Trump has been clear that he doesn't support the war. So at the end of the day, Zelensky knows that this resistance of Ukraine is complicated, and it's very challenging for it to keep going on. So that's why he's going around the world again, trying to raise the funds, trying to raise the military equipment that he needs as a last effort to somehow fight against Russia. But it's kind of hard to win because, Russia has a long history of winning wars, has an enormous territory. And despite all things that people say, Russia has been suffering sanctions since, the early 20th century. So Russia is a country that is accustomed to living and surviving in very difficult situations.
Of course, Dr. Marcus, you're right. I mean, again, as we continue to seeing this geopolitical change, not only in Russia, in the US, and also around the world, but the hardcore fact is China and the US continue to be locked in this heavy and also this unpredictable competition. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and focusing on international law and international relations. Well, Dr. Marcus, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the affairs within the international community. So thank you so much for doing this.